My son Trevor stood in the kitchen of the restaurant we built together and told me in front of his new business partner that I was the reason the place had never reached its potential. Not the debt, not the decisions I had watched him make over the past 8 months while smiling and staying quiet. Me, his mother, the woman who had sold her car, cashed out part of her pension early, and spent every Saturday for 3 years washing dishes and seating guests so Trevor's dream could survive long enough to matter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry right there. I simply untied my apron, folded it over the back of a chair, and walked out into the January cold without saying goodbye. The next morning, I stopped every automatic transfer going into Birchwood Kitchen. My husband Howard used to say that the hardest winters in Nova Scotia weren't the ones with the most snow. They were the quiet ones, where the cold arrived without ceremony and settled in so deeply you forgot what warmth felt like. Howard died 4 years ago, not dramatically, not with warning. He was raking leaves in the backyard of our house in Dartmouth, and then he simply wasn't anymore. The ambulance came. I stood on the porch in my socks and watched them work, and I already knew. 41 years of marriage ends, and the world keeps making the same sounds it always made. That's the part nobody tells you. Howard was an electrician his whole working life. He wasn't the kind of man who talked about money, but he managed it carefully, the way he managed everything. When he died, he left me the house, a modest savings account, and a life insurance policy that was enough to keep me stable if I was careful with it. I intended to be careful. I had always been careful. Trevor was our youngest. We also had a daughter, Lorraine, who lived in British Columbia with her husband and called every Sunday without fail. But Trevor was the one who stayed close. He lived 20 minutes away and came for dinner most weeks, and after Howard died, those dinners became something I counted on. He helped me carry boxes to the basement. He drove me to appointments when I didn't feel like going alone. For a long time after Howard, Trevor was the steadiest thing in my life. He had worked in restaurant kitchens since he was 19. Not always happily, not always successfully, but consistently. He loved cooking with a seriousness that I respected even when I didn't fully understand it. He once described to me for 45 minutes the difference between 2 types of broth. I didn't retain most of it, but I kept listening, because the way he talked about food was the way Howard used to talk about a well-run circuit. Like there was an integrity to it that mattered. About 2 years after Howard passed, Trevor sat across from me at the kitchen table one evening, with his laptop open and his hands folded in that careful way he had when he was nervous about something. "Mom," he said, "I think I've finally found the right location." He turned the screen toward me. A heritage building in downtown Dartmouth, exposed brick, wide windows facing the street, high ceilings, the kind of space that looked like it had been waiting for something to happen inside it. "Birchwood Kitchen," he said quietly. "Farm to table. Local suppliers. The menu changes with what's in season." I looked at his face while he talked. He looked like someone who had been carrying a plan for a very long time and was finally allowing himself to say it out loud. "What would you need to make it happen?" I asked. He swallowed once. "I have some savings, but to cover the deposit and the first few months while things get established, I'd need help." I thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. Because mothers do that. We think about it briefly and then we say yes. Because the alternative is watching someone we love give up on the version of their life that matters most to them. "Tell me the number," I said. He did. It was significant. Not impossible, but significant. "Okay," I said. Trevor's eyes filled immediately, which surprised me. He wasn't someone who cried easily. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," I said. "That's why I'm choosing to." For the first year, Birchwood Kitchen was everything Trevor had described. The menu changed every few weeks. The dining room was warm and simple. He sourced vegetables from a farm outside Windsor and fish from a supplier he'd known for years. I came in on weekends, and sometimes weeknights, helping wherever I fit. Folding napkins, answering the phone when the hostess was busy, running bread to tables when service got hectic. Those were good months. Trevor was exhausted and proud in equal measure, and I understood both feelings. Howard had looked that way when we first bought the house. The exhaustion of something finally being yours. Then Mitchell Carver arrived. The first time I met him, he was standing at the bar after service, one Thursday evening, talking to Trevor, with the kind of ease that made it clear they'd been talking for a while already. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s, well-dressed without trying too hard, with the sort of confident friendliness that fills a room before a person even finishes walking into it. Trevor introduced him with something close to excitement. "Mom, this is Mitchell Carver." He consults with restaurant groups on brand positioning and growth strategy. Mitchell extended his hand warmly. "Mrs. Alderton, I've heard wonderful things. Your son is building something genuinely special here." I shook his hand. He looked at me directly when he spoke, which I noticed and appreciated at the time. It wasn't until much later that I understood looking people directly in the eye was simply part of how Mitchell Carver operated. It wasn't warmth, it was technique. The changes started small. Mitchell suggested a new logo, cleaner, more modern. Then new menus, heavier stock, different font. Then a photography session for the restaurant's social media presence, which apparently required a full weekend and a crew of 4 people. Each change came with an explanation that sounded entirely reasonable. In competitive markets, first impressions determine everything. Local doesn't mean casual. You have to look like what you want to become before you become it. Trevor absorbed everything Mitchell said with a focus that should have reassured me. It didn't. Not because I thought Trevor was wrong to listen, but because I noticed when he stopped listening to anyone else. One Saturday evening, I arrived to help with service and found 2 men drilling new lighting fixtures into the dining room ceiling. The warm Edison bulbs Howard would have loved were gone, replaced with something colder and more dramatic. "What happened to the old lights?" I asked Trevor quietly between courses. He glanced up from a ticket. "Mitchell said they read as dated on camera." "On camera," I repeated. "For social content." "It matters, Mom." I said nothing more about it. The lights stayed. Over the following months, I watched Mitchell Carver redesign my son's restaurant, one careful suggestion at a time. The local farm vegetables remained on the menu, but they were now described in language that sounded imported from somewhere more expensive. The fish supplier Trevor had known for years was quietly replaced with another one Mitchell recommended, at higher cost, with better brand alignment. The chalkboard specials disappeared. A tasting menu appeared in their place, priced in a way that made the couples who used to come for midweek dinners stop coming quite as often. And Trevor, who had once called Birchwood Kitchen a place where people could eat well without pretending to be wealthy, began using phrases like elevated experience and curated identity in ways that made me feel like I was listening to someone else entirely. The requests for money became more frequent in the second year. At first, they were framed as temporary gaps, cash flow issues, while a large supplier invoice cleared, a staffing shortage requiring extra coverage. Then the amounts grew. Mitchell had proposed a private event series, invitation-only dinners for local business figures, which required new tableware and a private dining room renovation. That cost $12,000. Then came the proposal for a second location in Halifax, which Mitchell insisted was the natural next step and would establish Birchwood as a regional name. One evening I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by bank statements while Trevor paced the length of my living room, explaining why the Halifax lease needed to move forward before the space was taken by a competitor. "Mitchell says the timing is now or never," he said. I looked at the numbers in front of me. How much has the original location made in the last 3 months? Trevor stopped pacing. "We're in a growth phase. Revenue and profit aren't the same metric right now." I looked up slowly. That didn't answer my question. His jaw tightened. "You sound like you don't trust what we're building." That word. We. I wondered if he meant himself and me, the way it had once been, or himself and Mitchell. "I trust you," I said carefully. "I'm not sure I understand the business as well as I'd like to." That's exactly what Mitchell said would happen. The sentence came out before he caught himself. He looked away immediately. I set down my pen. "What does that mean?" Trevor rubbed the back of his neck. He said people from an older generation sometimes struggle with growth-oriented thinking, that it can feel threatening when it's actually just forward momentum. I stared at my son for a long moment. 40 years ago, I had sat in a delivery room convincing myself I could handle the next contraction, and I had been right. I had buried my husband while still standing upright. I had managed a household and a savings account through 2 recessions and one very difficult winter when the furnace failed, and I couldn't afford to replace it immediately. But apparently, I didn't understand forward momentum. "I'd like to meet with Mitchell properly," I said. "The three of us." Trevor looked relieved and uncomfortable at the same time. "Sure, of course." The meeting happened at Birchwood on a Tuesday morning before the kitchen opened. Mitchell arrived 5 minutes early and brought coffee, which I thought was a nice touch until I noticed he brought 2 cups, one for himself, one for Trevor. He looked genuinely surprised to see me holding my own travel mug. "Mrs. Alderton, wonderful." He set the cups down and smiled. "I think getting everyone aligned is really healthy." I asked him to walk me through the financial structure of his involvement. He did so smoothly, using enough industry language that a person who wasn't paying close attention might have nodded along without actually following. I had been paying close attention since he arrived. "What does your company charge per month?" I asked. Mitchell smiled. "My retainer structure is performance-linked. It scales with growth initiatives. So you earn more when the restaurant spends more on growth." A brief pause. "That's a simplified way of framing a more nuanced arrangement. But accurate?" Trevor shifted in his seat. "Mom, it's a fair question," Mitchell said smoothly. "And yes, in general terms, my compensation is tied to the expansion of the business. That aligns my interests with the restaurant's success." "It aligns your interests with the restaurant's spending," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." The temperature in the room changed. Not dramatically, but I felt it. Mitchell leaned back slightly. "I understand financial caution, especially at your stage of life, but Birchwood has real potential that won't stay available forever. At your stage of life, I was 63 years old. I had kept this restaurant alive with money from my pension and my late husband's insurance policy. And I was being told my stage of life was a limitation. I drove home that afternoon and called my oldest friend, Sandra Kowalski, who had been a bookkeeper for 30 years and had never once told me something I needed to hear in a way that wasn't honest. "Tell me what you're worried about," she said. So I did. All of it. Sandra listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How much total has gone in?" she asked. I told her. Another pause. "And you don't have full access to the business accounts. Trevor manages those. Ask for them," she said flatly. "Not as a favor, as someone who has a financial stake. If he hesitates, you have as your answer." I asked Trevor the following week for a full accounting of the business finances since opening. He said he'd put something together. 2 weeks passed. Nothing arrived. When I mentioned it again, he said Mitchell was compiling a comprehensive overview and it would be ready soon. I started to understand that soon meant never. Around that time, something else happened. A small thing, but it stayed with me. I came to Birchwood on a busy Friday evening to help with a private event Mitchell had organized. The dining room was full of people I didn't recognize, well-dressed, speaking with the kind of careful confidence that comes with money. I carried a tray of canapes while a young woman I hadn't met before moved through the room with a tablet, collecting contact information and talking about investment opportunities. At one point, a man in a gray suit nodded politely at me. "Are you part of the front-of-house team?" Before I could answer, Mitchell appeared beside me. "This is Trevor's mum. She helps out sometimes." I stood there holding a canapé tray in my own son's restaurant, which my money had made possible, and heard myself described as someone who helps out sometimes. I set the tray down on a side table and went to find Trevor. He was in the kitchen, focused on the pass, and when he glanced up and saw my face, he knew immediately something had happened. But Mitchell had already followed me in, and whatever Trevor might have said on his own didn't come. "Everything all right out there?" Mitchell asked, looking at me pleasantly. "Fine," I said, and I left. I didn't say anything to Trevor that night, but I thought about it for days, the way you replay a small moment that reveals something much larger. 3 weeks later, Trevor called and asked me to dinner. He said he wanted to talk properly. Just the two of us. And something in his voice made me think he was ready to apologize for the evening of the private event. I spent an hour getting ready, which I recognized even then as the particular vulnerability of mothers. We still want our children to be glad to see us. I made lemon squares to bring, because Trevor had loved them since he was 8 years old. When I arrived at his apartment, the table was set for 4. Ryan, Trevor's partner of 2 years was there, looking quietly nervous near the kitchen, and sitting at the table with a glass of wine, and his leather-bound notebook open in front of him was Mitchell Carver. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I walked in and put the lemon squares on the counter and sat down. Dinner was polite and uncomfortable. Mitchell talked about the Halifax opportunity, the investor who was interested, the timeline. Ryan barely spoke. Trevor refilled my water glass twice without making eye contact. After the plates were cleared, Mitchell slid a folder across the table toward me. "We've prepared the financing documents," he said. "Trevor mentioned you're open to discussing the Halifax expansion." I looked at Trevor. "Is that what I said?" He didn't answer. I opened the folder slowly. The language was dense, but the meaning emerged clearly enough. They were asking me to act as a guarantor on a commercial loan. The collateral listed included my house. I closed the folder. "No." Trevor looked up. "Mom, if you just read the—" "I read it." Mitchell leaned forward with the particular calm of someone who has had this conversation before and knows which pressure points to use. "Diana, the risk here is genuinely minimal. The investor interest is already confirmed." "This is simply, if the investor interest is confirmed," I said quietly, "then the bank doesn't need my house." Silence. Trevor pushed back from the table. "Why do you always do this?" "Do what?" "Make everything about protecting yourself instead of believing in what I'm building." The words landed precisely where they were meant to. I knew that. I also knew something else, something I had been slowly understanding for months. My son was not a cruel person, but he was a person who had been told repeatedly and skillfully that my caution was the obstacle between him and everything he deserved. I looked at him across the table. "I believe in you," I said. "I'm not sure I believe in everything that's happening around you." Mitchell shifted slightly in his chair. Trevor stood up. "You know what, Mom? Mitchell warned me this might happen. He said you'd resist anything that required real commitment." Real commitment. I had given this restaurant my pension withdrawal, my savings cushion, my weekends, my silence, on things that bothered me, and my faith in a son I loved without condition. And the man who had known Trevor for less than a year had apparently defined what real commitment looked like. I picked up my coat. Ryan said quietly, "Diana, please." But I was already moving toward the door. Outside it was cold in the way February in Nova Scotia is cold, which is to say it's cold that has given up being polite about itself. I sat in my car for a long time without turning on the heat. Then I drove home. I didn't sleep that night. At some point after 3 a.m, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table in Howard's old cardigan, which I still kept on the hook by the back door. I had stopped letting myself think about him quite as often. Because grief doesn't diminish, but you learn to ration it, to protect yourself from the full weight of it on ordinary days. But at 3 a.m, with a cold tea going cold in front of me, I thought about Howard. He was not a man who gave advice in speeches. He gave it in small sentences, sometimes weeks after the thing he was commenting on had already passed. Like he'd needed time to find the right words. After Trevor quit his first kitchen job over a conflict with a head chef, Howard waited 3 days and then said at dinner, "The problem with letting your pride make your decisions is that pride doesn't have to live with the consequences." Trevor had been 23 at the time and had gone quiet for the rest of the meal, which meant the sentence had landed. I thought about that now. The next morning, I called Sandra. "I need to look at the actual finances before I do anything else," I said. "Can you help me?" "Yes," she said. "Come over this afternoon." Sandra had a gift for making sense of numbers that were trying to avoid being understood. We sat at her dining room table for 3 hours, with every document I had access to, and what emerged wasn't clean. The expenses Mitchell had directed were significant and consistent. His consulting fees appeared under several different line items, described in ways that made them difficult to track cumulatively. Equipment upgrades, brand consultancy, strategic partnership development, strategy coordination. Taken individually, each could be explained. Added together, they represented a substantial portion of what I had contributed, flowing not into the restaurant itself, but into a company called Carver Group Advisory Inc., which Sandra confirmed was registered less than 3 years ago, with no public client record to speak of. "He's getting paid whether the restaurant profits or not," Sandra said, not as a question. "Yes," I said. She tapped her pen against one document in particular. And this one. She pushed it toward me. Did you sign this? I looked at it. A supplemental financial agreement connected to the business account. My name was at the bottom. No, I said slowly. Sandra studied it. The signature doesn't look quite right. My stomach turned over once, quietly and completely. We need to take this to someone, Sandra said carefully. Not tomorrow. Today. I made an appointment that afternoon with a lawyer named Ellen Tran, whose office was on Spring Garden Road in Halifax, and whose name Sandra had kept in her contacts for 15 years without needing it until now. Ellen was direct and precise, and she listened to the full account without interrupting, which is a quality I have come to associate with people who are genuinely good at what they do. She reviewed the documents while I sat astride from her. This signature, she said finally, would need to be verified, but if it wasn't produced by you, you have a significant problem, and so does Mr. Carver. I nodded once. In the meantime, she said, I would strongly advise you to formally cease all financial transfers to the business and to communicate all future correspondence in writing. I went home and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Canceling the transfers was easier than I expected, mechanically. Each click took something I had built over years and quietly removed it from the place it had been going without my full understanding of where it was actually landing. When I was done, I sat back and put my hands flat on the table and breathed. Then I wrote Trevor an email. I rewrote it 4 times. The first version said too much. The second said too little. The third was too angry, and the fourth was too apologetic. The fifth was simply what was true. I told him I had stopped the financial transfers. I told him I was requesting full accounting records and an explanation of all payments to Carver Group Advisory. I told him I had concerns about a document bearing my signature that I had not personally signed. And at the end, because it was the truest thing, and I wasn't ready to lose it entirely, I told him I loved him. He called 11 times before midnight. I didn't answer. His voicemail said things like, "You can't do this without warning, and payroll is due next week, and Mitchell says this is exactly what he was afraid of." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Can we talk?" Only the logistics of consequence. The next day, Ryan came to my door alone. He was younger than Trevor by 4 years and softer in temperament, and when I opened the door, he looked like someone who had been awake for most of the night. "Can I come in?" I made tea for both of us. We sat at the kitchen table, and after a moment, Ryan said the thing I had been waiting for someone on that side of things to say. "I don't think Trevor sees how bad this is." I wrapped my hands around my mug. "How bad is what, exactly?" "The real numbers." Ryan exhaled. "I found the full accounts last week. I don't think Trevor has looked at the actual totals. Mitchell handles all that." "Why?" Ryan looked at the table. "Because as long as he doesn't look directly at it, he can keep believing the next month will fix everything." There it was. My son wasn't stupid. He wasn't even reckless in the way I had sometimes told myself. He was afraid. Afraid that looking at the truth would mean admitting the version of his life he had built was collapsing. And Brandon, Mitchell, had made himself indispensable to that avoidance. Ryan slid a folded sheet of paper across the table toward me. "Outstanding balances." I printed it before Mitchell could notice. I read it slowly. The number at the bottom made my chest hurt in a way that was physical. "Suppliers," Ryan said quietly. 2 of them are threatening to go to collections. 1 staff member quit last month over a late paycheck. He swallowed. "Trevor told me things would stabilize once the Halifax launch happened." "And you believed him?" Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I believed he believed it." That was its own kind of answer. 3 days later, Trevor called, and this time I answered. He sounded different. Not apologetic, not defensive, hollow. "Something happened," he said. "Tell me." Mitchell changed the passwords on the social media accounts and the main booking platform. He said it was part of a system migration. "But it's been 4 days, and I still can't access anything." A pause. "The food supplier in Windsor called me directly because they couldn't reach anyone through the business contacts." I closed my eyes briefly. "Trevor, I think." He stopped. "I think I made a mistake." 6 words. I had been waiting 8 months for 6 words. "Don't sign anything," I said immediately. "Don't delete anything. Don't call Mitchell until you've talked to Ellen Tran." "Who's Ellen Tran?" "A lawyer. I'll send you her contact." 2 weeks later, we sat around the conference table in Ellen's office. "Trevor," Ryan, myself, Sandra, and Mitchell Carver, who arrived in the same camel coat he always wore and sat down with the same composed expression he always had. He looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. Ellen had arranged the documents in neat piles. She walked through them the way a good contractor walks through a structural issue, methodically, without drama, but making it impossible to pretend the problem wasn't serious. The compensation structure, the scaled fees, the payments across multiple line items that accumulated into a total neither Trevor nor I had ever seen presented clearly. The Halifax proposal that had no confirmed investor, only a letter of intent from a party Mitchell himself had introduced. Trevor stared at the totals in silence. Then Ellen placed the suspicious document on the table. "This signature," she said, looking at Mitchell steadily. "Our analysis indicates inconsistencies with Mrs. Alderton's authentic signing pattern." Mitchell's expression didn't change entirely, but something shifted behind it. Document handling in fast-moving business situations can sometimes result in process irregularities. Is that an acknowledgement that you were involved in processing this document? A pause just long enough to mean something. "I managed administrative correspondence, yes." Trevor looked up from the table. He looked at Mitchell, and I watched him see something for what felt like the first time. "Did you forge my mother's signature?" Mitchell's voice cooled perceptibly. "That's a significant accusation. That's not an answer." The room stayed quiet. Ellen allowed the silence to sit there, which I respected. Finally, Trevor turned to me. His face looked like someone much younger than 34, which is the face of someone who has just understood something that can't be unknown. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." Not performed, not rehearsed. Just 2 words carrying the full weight of everything they needed to carry. Mitchell left the meeting shortly after, with Ellen's written notice that Carver Group Advisory would be under financial review, pending possible legal proceedings. He was as composed walking out as he had been walking in. That was the thing about him. He never broke character, because the character was the whole strategy. For almost 2 weeks after that meeting, I barely heard from Trevor. I understood why. Shame is a private experience. You can't rush it out of someone, and trying usually makes it worse. Then, on a Sunday afternoon in March, I heard a car in my driveway. Trevor stood on my porch in a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the weather, holding a paper bag from a bakery on Quinpool Road. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. He also looked more like himself than he had in months. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped back from the door. He put the bakery bag on the counter without ceremony. Inside was a lemon loaf, which I hadn't asked for and he had remembered anyway. We sat at the kitchen table. Trevor wrapped his hands around a coffee mug and looked out the window at the gray March sky for a while before speaking. "I kept thinking," he said slowly, "that if Birchwood succeeded in a big enough way, it would be like, I don't know, like Dad would have seen something come of all of it. The money, the years." I stayed quiet. And Mitchell made me feel like that was possible, like it was right there. He paused. He was very good at that. "Yes," I said. He was. Trevor looked at me. "I know that doesn't explain how I treated you." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." The honesty of that landed between us, without any effort to soften it. I had learned, in 4 years of navigating grief and then that softening things before they've been fully felt doesn't help anyone. "I stopped seeing you," Trevor said quietly. "I started seeing you as an obstacle, and he stopped. "That's not okay. I know that." I looked at my son. 34 years old, sitting in my kitchen with a paper bag from a bakery, and the kind of face that meant he was saying what he actually meant. "I need time," I said simply. "Not forever. Just time." He nodded immediately. "I know, and I need honesty going forward. Full accounts, full access. No version of things will stabilize." "Yes. And, I paused. "I need you to understand something. What you contributed to this, the things you said about my limitations, the things you let Mitchell say while you stayed quiet, that hurt. Not just the money." His eyes filled. He didn't look away. "I know," he said again. We sat for a while longer. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way. Kitchens are quiet on Sunday afternoons in winter, not empty, just settled. Eventually, Trevor asked if I had the recipe for my lemon squares written down somewhere, because Ryan had been asking about them. And somehow that small, ordinary question opened something that had been shut for months. We spent the rest of the afternoon at that table. I found the recipe card in the drawer where I keep Howard's handwriting on things, his measurements for the deck railing, his notes for the furnace filter, his grocery lists from 15 years ago that I kept for no practical reason except that his handwriting felt like a form of company. Trevor held the recipe card carefully, the way you hold something when you understand it matters. She had better penmanship than me, he said softly. He did, I corrected, smiling. Trevor looked up, and then he cried, which he hadn't allowed himself to do in my presence for a very long time. Ellen Tran's investigation eventually confirmed what Sandra had suspected. The signature on the supplemental document had been reproduced from a prior form I had legitimately signed. Mitchell settled privately before the matter could go to formal litigation. Trevor chose not to fight for what remained of Birchwood Kitchen. The debt was real and the brand was damaged, and sometimes the most honest thing is to acknowledge when something is over. He worked for 6 months at a Portuguese restaurant on Barrington Street, just cooking, no growth strategy, no brand alignment, just the actual work. He said it was the most grounded he had felt in years. The following spring, he and Ryan came over on a Sunday, and we made Howard's pancake recipe together, which requires more patience than most people expect, and rewards you for it entirely. Trevor stood at the stove with the same serious concentration he brought to everything culinary, adjusting the heat by feel the way Howard used to adjust everything, by paying attention rather than following instructions exactly. Ryan set the table. I made coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the first crabapple blossoms were coming in along the fence, the ones Howard planted 20 years ago, because he liked the idea of something that came back on its own every year without needing to be asked. The pancakes were good. They were actually very good. We ate slowly, at the kitchen table, with the morning light coming in from the east the way it does in early spring in Nova Scotia, low and gold and completely unhurried. And for the first time in longer than I wanted to count, I wasn't bracing for anything.